The Pharaoh's erased queen. The sands of Egypt have a way of keeping secrets. For over 3,000 years, the Nile's shifting banks and the desert's creeping dunes have preserved and hidden entire chapters of history. Among them lies the riddle of the Pharaoh's erased queen. Her name once graced temple walls, her likeness carved in stone alongside the symbols of divine authority. And yet, in the centuries that followed her reign, her images were hammered away, her inscriptions chiseled into nothingness, her statues buried or recarved to resemble someone else. Mainstream Egyptology offers us one probable suspect, Queen Hatshepsut, the woman who dared to rule as pharaoh during Egypt's 18th dynasty, around 1479 BCE. For decades she held the throne, wearing the false beard of kingship and presiding over a golden age of trade, architecture, and stability. But years after her death, her stepson and successor Thutmose III seems to have ordered her memory systematically destroyed. Official explanations suggest politics, erasing her to restore a clean line of male succession. Yet there are quirks in the record that keep this story from being simple. Certain monuments of hers were spared entirely, as if someone in the court defied the command. Inscriptions with her name are found hidden deep inside temples, visible only to priests. And in one remote quarry, the chiselling was left unfinished, as if the erasers were interrupted or lost their nerve. Some fringe historians point to even stranger possibilities. They note that Hatshepsut's reign coincided with trade expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, a place Egyptologists still cannot pinpoint on a map. These journeys brought exotic goods, frankincense, myrrh, and live myrrh trees into Egypt. Could Hatshepsut have brought back more than goods, perhaps knowledge or alliances that threatened Egypt's power balance? So erasing her would not just remove her name, it would conceal the deals she struck. We also find echoes of her story in later Egyptian tradition. The goddess Ma'at, embodiment of truth, is often shown with her feather symbol, yet in a handful of post-Hatshepsut temples, the feather is missing, replaced by symbols of silence. Coincidence? Possibly, but the overlap is tempting to consider. What makes her erasure all the more puzzling is that scholars still debate whether it was an act of hatred, a political necessity, or even part of a larger religious shift. We know ancient Egypt occasionally rewrote its own past. Pharaohs recarved monuments to claim victories they never won, or obliterated the memory of rivals. But here, the methodical nature of the campaign feels different. The fragments of her face we've recovered, smooth, idealized, timeless, still carry that quiet defiance. They remind us that history is not simply what happened, but what someone wanted remembered. And in the case of the Pharaoh's erased queen, someone wanted very badly for her not to be remembered at all. The vanished Library of Alexandria, in the heart of the ancient Mediterranean, where trade ships from Greece, Egypt, Rome and beyond crossed paths, there once stood a building that seemed almost mythic in its ambition. The Great Library of Alexandria was not just a collection of scrolls, it was a vault for the sum of human knowledge as it existed more than 2,000 years ago. Founded in the 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic dynasty, it aimed to gather every text from every culture, Greek philosophy, Egyptian records, Babylonian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Chinese maps, and possibly accounts from lands we still have not identified. Mainstream history tells us the library fell victim to accidents of war and time. Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE, a later invasion under Emperor Aurelian, and the eventual shift of power to Christian Rome all played their part. Each event, we're told, burned or scattered parts of the collection. Yet here lies the first oddity. No ancient source clearly states when or how the entire library was destroyed. Its death is a foggy accumulation of rumours, with gaps big enough to sail a trireme through. Some historians suspect the destruction narrative was, in part, a cover. After all, the Ptolemies were said to confiscate any manuscripts brought into the city by travellers, make copies, and return the duplicates while keeping the originals. Over decades, this policy would have amassed unique, possibly controversial works, ones that could challenge religious doctrine, undermine political authority, or reveal technologies far ahead of their time. Fringe theories go further still, suggesting that parts of the library's holdings were secretly relocated rather than lost. The Serapeum, an annex temple and sister library, was rumoured to hold the most dangerous scrolls, including astronomical charts that hinted the Earth was far older than the official timeline allowed. Certain Arab scholars in the Middle Ages referenced texts from Alexandria that no longer existed in their day. Were they working from salvaged manuscripts? There's also the peculiar case of the so-called Alexandrian codices, a handful of manuscripts in private collections during the Renaissance, attributed to unknown Greek-Egyptian scribes. Their existence suggests at least some of the library's treasures survived centuries beyond the supposed final destruction. Even within the archaeological record, tantalizing hints remain. Beneath modern Alexandria lie massive stone vaults, sealed since antiquity, which some believe are part of the original royal quarter. Excavations are slow, hindered by the fact that much of the city sits underwater. Officially, no direct link to the library has been proven. Unofficially, whispers persist of artifacts quietly removed during underwater surveys. Scholars still debate whether the Great Library was truly destroyed in a single catastrophic moment, or whether its disappearance was more deliberate, a slow, selective removal of dangerous ideas under the guise of accidental loss. The irony is sharp. In trying to preserve the safest version of history, someone may have erased the most brilliant map of the human mind ever assembled. And so, the vanished library remains less a story of fire and ash, and more one of shadows and silence. Somewhere between the truth and the myth lies a possibility far more unnerving, that some of its secrets were never lost at all, just hidden in places we have yet to look. The forgotten city beneath the desert can hide almost anything. Beneath its endless sands lie the bones of civilizations, waiting for the right wind, or the right archaeologist, to reveal them. One such place, uncovered in recent decades, has forced historians to quietly admit they might have overlooked an entire chapter of human history. It is the ancient city of Tanis, not the biblical city some may recall from legend, but a sprawling urban complex in northern Egypt that was swallowed by sand and erased from official accounts for over 1,000 years. Mainstream excavation records tell us Tanis was rediscovered in the 1930s by French archaeologists, revealing streets, temples, and royal tombs preserved in astonishing condition. The stone carvings and artifacts bore the hallmarks of Egypt's 21st and 22nd dynasties, around 1070 to 720 BCE. Yet here's the strangeness. Tanis does not appear in the major historical annals of the time. The rulers who built its grand temples are mentioned elsewhere, but their connection to this vast city is conspicuously absent. One accepted theory is that Tanis rose to prominence when the Nile shifted its course, cutting off other cities from vital trade. But if that were so, why erase it from the official narrative? Why no triumphant inscriptions proclaiming its role as a royal capital? Some scholars suggest political rivalry. Perhaps Tanis was controlled by a faction that lost power, and the victors decided to wipe their achievements from memory. Fringe researchers have noted even stranger finds. Among the artifacts were blocks of stone with inscriptions clearly originating from the great temples of Pyrameses, a city abandoned centuries earlier. How did they get here? Was Tanis built using dismantled monuments from older, perhaps more controversial sites? One granite lintel bore the cartouche of Ramesses II, yet Teu. His carving style suggested it had been altered, reworked to fit a new narrative. The burial goods tell their own story. In one royal tomb, gold death masks and jewellery matched the quality of earlier dynasties, but with symbols that don't quite match the standard Egyptian pantheon. There are hints of foreign influence, motifs that some link to the Levant, or even further afield. Could Tanis have been a hub for outsiders, a cosmopolitan centre whose cultural blending threatened the rigid identity of the Egyptian state? The site's preservation raises more questions. Sandstorms that might obliterate other settlements seemed instead to have sealed Tanis in a protective shroud. When the city was finally uncovered, some areas looked almost as if the inhabitants had left in a hurry. Ceramics, mid-use, tools abandoned on workbenches. Was it an environmental disaster, political purge, or something more mysterious that caused such a sudden departure? Scholars still debate whether Tanis was deliberately struck from the record as an act of political revenge, or if its erasure was part of a broader rewriting of history during a turbulent period. But the effect is the same. The sands turned the city into a ghost, invisible to memory until the modern age. And as excavation continues, each artifact pulled from beneath the dunes feels less like a discovery and more like a message, one meant to outlast those who tried to silence it. The censored scrolls of the Dead Sea. In the winter of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd searching for a stray goat tossed a stone into a cave near Qumran by the Dead Sea. Instead of the bleat of an animal, he heard the shatter of pottery. Inside, he and his companions found clay jars containing ancient scrolls, texts written in Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek, some dating as far back as the 3rd century BCE. This accidental discovery would become one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mainstream history tells us the scrolls include early versions of biblical texts, community rules, and commentaries belonging to a Jewish sect, often thought to be the Essenes. Many have been carefully translated, preserved, and studied. Yet from the moment of their discovery, the scrolls have been surrounded by secrecy and controversy. It took decades, far longer than expected, for all the discovered manuscripts to be made public. In the meantime, only a small circle of scholars had access to them. Official explanations cite the complexity of restoration, the fragility of the parchment, and the painstaking process of translation. But skeptics point out that these reasons do not account for the unusual level of control over who could see the documents. Theories began to swirl. Were there passages that conflicted too strongly with established religious teachings? Did they contain accounts of historical events that contradicted the accepted timelines of Judaism, Christianity, or even the origins of Western civilization? Among the most debated are the so-called Temple Scroll and the Copper Scroll. The Temple Scroll describes a vision of a future temple with laws far stricter than those in the Hebrew Bible, hinting at an alternate religious authority that could undermine mainstream interpretations. The Copper Scroll, on the other hand, reads like a treasure map, listing dozens of hidden caches of gold and silver, possibly temple treasures concealed during the Roman conquest. Mainstream scholars often dismiss it as symbolic or exaggerated, but no one has definitively proven or disproven its claims. Even more controversial are fragments that suggest messianic figures other than Jesus, written around the same era as early Christianity. If authenticated and understood in their full context, these could rewrite parts of religious history by showing that the concept of a saviour was not unique to one movement, but a recurring theme in the region's spiritual landscape. Over the years, access restrictions have eased, and many scrolls are now digitized. Yet there are persistent whispers in academic circles that some fragments, those too politically or theologically explosive, were quietly removed from circulation. The official catalogues do not always match the earliest inventories taken when the scrolls were first brought to Jerusalem. Scholars still debate whether these omissions are the result of innocent mismanagement or deliberate censorship, but one fact is hard to ignore: the scrolls are incomplete, and not only because time has damaged them. Somewhere in the long decades between discovery and publication, pages of humanity's oldest surviving records seem to have gone missing. And so the caves of Qumran gave us both a treasure and a riddle, one that might never be fully solved, because some of the answers may still be locked away in drawers, vaults, or private collections far from the desert where they were born. The missing emperor of China, China's imperial history is famously well documented, its dynasties and rulers meticulously recorded in the 24 histories, the official chronicles spanning millennia. Yet tucked between the familiar names and dates, there exists an unsettling silence, a missing emperor whose reign seems to have been deliberately erased. This is not a figure lost to time, but one stricken from the record with surgical precision. The mystery centers on the Qin dynasty, the first to unify China under a centralized imperial system in 221 BCE. Qin Shi Huang, the dynasty's founder, is legendary. The Great Wall, the Terracotta Army, his obsession with immortality. But between his reign and the rise of the Han dynasty, official histories contain odd omissions. Archaeological hints suggest that after Qin Shi Huang's death, there was a brief reign, possibly by one of his sons, or a high-ranking court official acting as emperor, that does not appear in the sanctioned timeline. Mainstream historians sometimes attribute this gap to the reign of Qin Shi, Qin Shi Huang's second son, who ruled from 210 to 207 BCE before the dynasty collapsed. Yet the written records describe Qin Shi as weak and incompetent, with his years in power reduced to a cautionary tale. The problem? Excavations of administrative seals and inscriptions in remote provinces refer to imperial decrees dated to an era name that does not match either Qin Shi Huang or Qin Shi. These anomalies hint at an unrecorded ruler, someone who issued commands across the empire, yet whose name is absent from official history. One fringe theory suggests a court coup following Qin Shi Huang's death, where a regent or rival briefly seized power before being overthrown and erased from the chronicles. Another possibility is that the missing emperor represented a faction opposed to the legalist philosophy that defined Qin rule, perhaps advocating policies the victorious Han dynasty wanted forgotten. Adding to the intrigue is a peculiar tomb uncovered in Shaanxi province. The burial chamber, smaller than a royal mausoleum but far grander than that of a typical noble, contained jade burial suits, lacquered coffins, and ceremonial weapons. The inscriptions had been violently defaced, the personal name gouged out, while leaving the titles Son of Heaven intact. Whoever lay here once claimed the mantle of emperor, but their identity was deliberately removed. Chinese historiography is no stranger to damnatio memoriae, the practice of erasing disgraced rulers or officials from the record, but scholars still debate whether this missing emperor was a usurper, a reformer, or simply an inconvenient branch in the Qin family tree. What makes the case unusual is the combination of silence in the texts and physical traces in the archaeological record, two narratives that refuse to align. If the Qin dynasty's rise was a triumph of order over chaos, its fall was chaos clawing back the stage, and somewhere in that collapse, an emperor reigned briefly, long enough to leave marks on clay, bronze, and jade. Marks that, despite centuries of erasure, still whisper of a chapter China's first historians did not want us to read. The silenced builders of Stonehenge. On the Salisbury Plain in southern England, the great stones of Stonehenge rise like the ribs of a petrified giant. Their arrangement is deliberate, their alignments precise, marking the solstices, the turning of the year, the ancient dance of light and shadow. For centuries, historians have debated who built this monument and why. Yet buried beneath the debates lies a quieter mystery, the near-total disappearance of the people who actually raised it from the historical record. Mainstream archaeology traces Stonehenge's construction to several phases between roughly 3000 and 1500 BCE, involving communities skilled in engineering, astronomy, and long-distance trade. Excavations reveal that these people transported bluestones from the Preseli Hills in Wales, over 150 miles away, long before the age of the wheel in Britain. This feat alone suggests an organised, cooperative society with sophisticated knowledge. Yet we have no surviving name for them, no written records, no preserved oral tradition that clearly claims responsibility. The dominant narrative says they were Neolithic farmers, gradually replaced by incoming Bronze Age cultures. But here the story grows strange. Around 2300 BCE, at the height of Stonehenge's activity, genetic and isotope studies show a sudden demographic shift. The original builder's genetic signature largely disappears from the region within a few generations, replaced by people from continental Europe. It's as if the builders themselves simply vanished. Some scholars propose disease or climate change as the culprit. Others point to evidence of violent conflict, mass graves containing individuals with fatal injuries, clustered in the same period as Stonehenge's later modifications. Yet none of this explains why their cultural fingerprints, tools, pottery styles, burial practices were so thoroughly replaced, ost, as if the newcomers actively erased what came before. Fringe interpretations go further. The precision of the stone's astronomical alignments and the sourcing of materials from distant quarries have led some to suggest that the builders possessed knowledge considered too advanced for their era, knowledge that may have unsettled those who came after. Could the silence in the archaeological record be the result of a deliberate attempt to sever continuity, to ensure that whatever purpose Stonehenge once served could not be fully understood by future generations? We find tantalising clues in nearby sites like Durrington Walls, where feasting remains suggest gatherings of hundreds or even thousands, possibly timed with celestial events. These people weren't isolated farmers, they were part of a network, moving ideas and goods across great distances. And yet, within a century, their monuments were abandoned or repurposed by cultures who left no explanation. Scholars still debate whether Stonehenge's builders were wiped out, absorbed into incoming populations, or voluntarily dispersed. But the absence of their voices is conspicuous. We can measure their engineering skill in tons of stone, we can trace their trade routes across seas and hills, and still we cannot name them. In the end, the monument they left behind stands as both a masterpiece and a memorial. It tells us that they existed, and that someone, somewhere, decided we would know their work, but not their story. The disappearing gods of Mesoamerica. Across the jungles and highlands of ancient Mesoamerica, stone temples rise in stepped layers toward the sky. Their walls are carved with fierce deities, serpents with feathered wings, jaguars crowned with flames, skeletal lords of the underworld. These gods were once central to the lives of millions, shaping calendars, festivals, and even the fates of kings. And yet, in some regions, entire pantheons seem to vanish from the record as if erased by their own worshippers. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges that religious traditions in Mesoamerica evolved over centuries. The Olmec gods gave way to Zapotec, Maya, and Mexica pantheons, each adapting or absorbing earlier figures. But here's the puzzle. In certain city-states, entire deities disappear abruptly. No gradual decline, no blending into new forms, just a sudden absence from carvings, codices, and temple murals. One striking example comes from the classic Maya city of Piedras Negras, where depictions of the maize god dominate early monuments. Then, within a generation, his image is gone. In his place appear other symbols, some still undeciphered, that suggest a rapid theological shift. Yet no inscriptions record the reason. This is unusual in Maya culture, which often chronicled political upheavals and religious events in meticulous detail. Some scholars suspect political motives. In Mesoamerica, religion and rulership were intertwined. Removing a god from public worship could also undermine the legitimacy of rival dynasties. Others suggest environmental triggers. If drought or disaster struck, a god associated with fertility or rain might be abandoned in favour of new divine patrons. But in several cases, such as at Teotihuacan, gods vanished during periods of stability, not crisis. Fringe researchers point to a more unsettling idea that certain deities were linked to knowledge are rituals later deemed dangerous. In Aztec tradition, for instance, there are fragmentary references to gods who walked among men, being sent away or hidden. Whether these are metaphors or memories of a suppressed cult remains unclear. The Spanish conquest complicates the picture. Conquistadors and missionaries destroyed vast numbers of codices, erasing much of the written record. Yet even in pre-contact archaeology, we see evidence of deliberate iconoclasm, temples stripped of their original reliefs, altars recarved to honour new gods. In some instances, the earlier deities' names were literally scratched out of inscriptions. One of the strangest finds comes from a cache of painted pottery buried beneath the temple floor in Veracruz. The vessels depict a serpent-faced goddess, unknown in any surviving mythology. She appears in scenes of agricultural plenty and warfare, but her name glyph is missing or deliberately obscured on every piece. Scholars still debate whether she was a local variant of a known deity or a lost goddess whose worship was purposefully obliterated. What's clear is that the disappearance of these gods was not always the result of foreign conquest. Often it was the work of those who once revered them, an act of cultural surgery that left their civilizations without certain divine figures they once held sacred. And so the temples of Mesoamerica tell two stories, one of grandeur and devotion, and another of sudden quiet betrayals, where even the gods themselves could be erased. The covered-up collapse of the Indus Valley. In the dusty plains of present-day Pakistan and northwest India, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of one of the world's earliest urban civilizations, the Indus Valley, also known as the Harappan civilization. Flourishing from around 2600 to 1900 BCE, its cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, were marvels of planning, grid-like streets, advanced drainage systems, standardized weights, and a script still undeciphered to this day. Yet the most baffling part of its story is how it ended, and why so little of that ending appears in historical memory. Mainstream theories long held that the civilization declined due to climate change, shifting river patterns that dried the fertile plains, or due to the arrival of Indo-Aryan migrants around 1500 BCE. But the archaeological record offers hints that the collapse was neither so simple nor so passive. In Mohenjo-Daro, skeletons have been found lying in streets, some showing signs of violent injury. In Harappa, layers of burning suggest destructive events, not just gradual abandonment. Yet what's most curious is the way later cultures in the region seem to have almost completely ignored the Indus Valley's existence. The Vedic texts, often cited as key early Indian literature, make little to no direct mention of these once great cities, despite their monumental scale and proximity in time. It's as if the Harappans were not merely forgotten, but actively written out of the cultural memory. Fringe historians have proposed that the Indus collapse might have been the result of internal revolt or a devastating epidemic, scenarios that later elites might have wanted to hide. Others suggest a more political motive, that the new Indo-Aryan order sought to erase the legacy of an older, possibly rival, cultural identity. The near-total absence of the Harappans in later myth or legend is unusual, especially when compared to how most ancient societies mythologized their predecessors. Adding to the mystery are the seals and tablets bearing the Indus script. Despite decades of study, no one has conclusively deciphered them. If they could be read, they might reveal accounts of the civilization's final years, and perhaps explain why its memory was suppressed. Some researchers even speculate that the language encoded on these seals was deliberately excluded from subsequent linguistic traditions, a form of cultural erasure more subtle than burning cities. There's also the question of continuity. Artifacts like pottery designs and agricultural tools suggest that descendants of the Harappans lived on in rural communities for centuries, blending with new populations. Yet these communities left no clear oral history linking themselves to the great cities. Was this amnesia natural over time, or was it cultivated? Scholars still debate whether the Indus Valley's fall was an unavoidable environmental tragedy, a violent conquest, or a politically motivated cover-up that buried not just a civilization, but its very identity. Whatever the truth, the ghost of the Harappan world lingers in its silent streets, its dry wells, and the untranslatable marks on clay seals. They built cities that were centuries ahead of their time, only for their story to be reduced to a scattering of bricks in the dust. And perhaps that was exactly how someone wanted it remembered. The forgotten African pharaohs of the Black Nile. Along the southern stretch of the Nile, far beyond the shadow of the Giza pyramids, lies Nubia, today's Sudan. Here an ancient kingdom rose and fell, one that ruled Egypt itself for nearly a century, yet was later all but erased from the pages of history. These were the pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, sometimes called the Kushite pharaohs, whose empire stretched from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean. Their story began in the city of Napata, around the 8th century BCE. The Kushite kings, Pianki, Shabaka, Taharqa, marched north and conquered a divided Egypt, uniting the Nile Valley under one throne. They revived ancient religious traditions, rebuilt temples, and resisted foreign invaders. In many ways, they saw themselves as restorers of Egypt's greatness, not outsiders. Yet after their eventual defeat by the Assyrians, Egyptian scribes and later historians treated them as little more than a footnote. Their monuments were defaced, their names scratched from temple walls, their achievements attributed to others. Even modern schoolbooks often skip directly from the New Kingdom to later foreign rulers, bypassing the Kushite era entirely. Why? Partly, it was a matter of politics. Egypt's later rulers, especially those under Greek and Roman control, preferred to emphasize Egypt's Mediterranean connections rather than its African roots. A dynasty of black African pharaohs ruling over the land of the gods didn't fit the image they wanted to present. The erasure went further than just Egypt. For centuries, Western scholars downplayed Nubia's role in ancient history, portraying it as a peripheral culture rather than a powerful civilization in its own right. Excavations in the 20th century revealed that Napata and its later capital, Meroe, were vibrant cities filled with monumental pyramids, advanced ironworking, and a distinct written script. But even these finds were slow to enter the popular narrative. Perhaps the most telling sign of this cover-up lies in art. In temple carvings that survive the chisels of erasers, the Kushite pharaohs are depicted with distinct African features, broad noses, full lips, yet later artistic reproductions in textbooks often softened these traits to fit more Eurocentric ideals. Over time, the true image of these kings faded from public view. Today, archaeologists in Sudan are slowly piecing together the lost legacy of these rulers, uncovering royal tombs filled with gold, inscriptions detailing military victories, and evidence of vast trade networks reaching deep into Africa. Still, the gap in public awareness remains huge. The Kushite pharaohs were not just a side chapter in Egypt's history, they were its rulers, its builders, its defenders, and their near erasure from mainstream history may be one of the most deliberate cultural omissions of the ancient world. They didn't just vanish, someone made them disappear. The city that vanished beneath the sea, Heraklion. For more than 1,000 years, Heraklion existed only in myth. Ancient Greek texts spoke of it as a great Egyptian port city where Helen of Troy once sought refuge and where pharaohs welcomed foreign envoys with golden gifts. Yet by the time medieval travellers came searching, there was nothing. No ruins, no coastline, not even a whisper of its precise location. It was as if the city had never existed at all. In reality, Heraklion wasn't a myth. It was a thriving metropolis at the mouth of the Nile, a place where Egypt met the Mediterranean world. It was filled with towering temples, colossal statues, and bustling docks where traders from Greece, Phoenicia, and beyond exchanged goods, news, and ideas. Its strategic position made it one of Egypt's most important cities during the late Pharaonic and early Ptolemaic periods. And yet, it vanished. Sometime around the 2nd century BCE, earthquakes shook the delta. Rising seas, unstable clay soils, and possibly even a massive flood caused parts of the city to sink into the water. Within decades, Heraklion had slipped beneath the waves entirely, taking with it centuries of history, treasures, and records. Over time, Alexandria rose as Egypt's dominant port, and Heraklion faded from maps, then from memory. By the Middle Ages, only scattered legends remained. Some claimed it had been swallowed by the gods for offending the temples. Others believed it was Atlantis under a different name. In reality, the truth was more complicated and more tragic. The city had not just sunk naturally, its demise had been quietly sealed by political choices. As Alexandria's importance grew, rulers and chroniclers alike had no interest in preserving the memory of a rival city. References to Heraklion in official records dwindled, and soon it was erased almost entirely from Egyptian history. Centuries, scholars debated whether it had ever been real at all, that is, until the year 2000, when underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio discovered its remains off Egypt's north coast. Beneath layers of silt, divers uncovered colossal statues of gods, massive temple ruins, warships preserved in mud, and hundreds of inscriptions, evidence of a rich, multicultural city long forgotten. But perhaps the strangest discovery was how much had been deliberately left out of history books. The inscriptions revealed political treaties, tax records, and religious practices that challenged the clean, simplified timeline of Egypt's decline and Rome's rise. Heraklion wasn't just a port, it was a centre of power, wealth, and influence that rivaled Alexandria itself. The fact that its memory was so thoroughly erased suggests more than just the indifference of time. It suggests that someone, somewhere, wanted it forgotten. Today, Heraklion lies preserved in the murky waters of Abukir Bay, a ghost city beneath the sea. Its rediscovery forces us to rethink what we know about Egypt's final centuries of independence. And it leaves us with one haunting thought. If an entire city of temples, statues, and ships could be erased for 2,000 years, what else has been swallowed by both the sea and the silence of history? Conculsion. Across these 10 shadows in the historical record, a pattern emerges, not of isolated mysteries, but of a tapestry of human memory deliberately unpicked. The gaps are as telling as the fragments we can still see. Ancient stones that should be standing have vanished. Scrolls that should be preserved are reduced to ash. Names that once carried power are reduced to whispers. Perhaps these cover-ups were acts of control, or perhaps they were desperate measures to protect knowledge from falling into the wrong hands. Either way, the result is the same. Our picture of the past is fractured, filtered, and often misleading. Yet, in chasing the threads, in questioning the official stories, we are quietly piecing together something closer to the truth, one uncovered shard at a time. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest cover-up of all is that history is never truly finished.